Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that all of you were willing to watch this presentation that I have put together. This presentation is about an ongoing type of immigration that is seldom spoken about in any institutes or media, and that's the mass immigration of women into Europe and the Western world as a whole. I'd like to give a special thanks to Professor Marek Chorakiewicz for giving me the opportunity to show this presentation at the Institute of World Politics. First, I'd like to give a brief introduction into who I am. My name is David Lorentzon. I have studied web programming and have a bachelor's in polymer engineering. I currently work as a hotel manager at a rural family-owned hotel. In Sweden, I've been politically active for the last 4 years, doing different kinds of media and also running as a political candidate in local elections in Sweden. Now, I'm currently running as a candidate in the European Union Parliament elections taking place in June this year. I'd like to give you a story of how I got into this research. You could say that it all started with the European migration crisis of 2015. If you remember the events of that year, you saw that these large groups of migrants walking all the way to Europe until they reach a wealthy European country such as Germany or Sweden. If you remember the media at the time, when you saw the images of these migrant groups, you noticed that the vast majority of them were men, in particular, young and capable men. Here you can see some photos presented by the media at the time. As you can see, it's mostly men. So from these events, a very common impression was that the vast majority of immigration that wealthy European countries are getting are overwhelmingly men from the Middle East. I got interested in doing my own research into Sweden's mass immigration, so I decided to download all of the available data and work with it myself, do my own graphs. I felt compelled to do it myself because I could not find anyone doing research that had taken gender into account. All you saw were the total numbers, but never a breakdown of how many men versus women that were coming in. Now, to my surprise, the foreign-born population in Sweden was very gender balanced, close to being a 50-50 split. That got me thinking, how's that possible? What we saw portrayed in the media was 70, 80, and even 90% men, literally walking all the way to countries such as Sweden. So I was expecting that the foreign-born population to be at least 60% men or more, but that was not the case. So then I started breaking it down by country, starting with the usual suspects such as Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and so on. And I saw the expected results. It showed an overwhelming proportion of men. So then the question is, if migration to Sweden is gender balanced, where are all the women coming from? All of the foreign men you see migrate to Sweden, there must be an almost equal amount of women coming in from somewhere else. And so I continued to dig into the data and to look for answers. What I discovered was that most immigration coming into Sweden is not gender balanced. It typically tilts towards being heavily male or heavily female dominated. Some countries Sweden received lots of men from, and from other countries Sweden received lots of women from. I had stumbled upon something that I found truly fascinating. Sweden is getting mass immigration of women. It all started with detailed research of immigration into Sweden, which I later got the opportunity to present on alternative media in Sweden called Sweb TV, which did rather well. It managed to get a lot of attention. Due to Sweden having, let's see here, this is the results that when I gathered all of that data, I basically divided all of the entire world into red and blue. So the red color you see here is where you received a majority female immigration from. The green country you see on the map is Sweden. That's the data I'm comparing to. And all of the blue countries you can see on the world is where majority male immigration was coming from. And what you can see here is that there is clear geographical divides across the world. East and West Europe is clearly divided between Eastern Europe being majority female immigration and Western Europe being clearly majority male immigration. You can see here that the Middle East, Northern Africa, and the Indian subcontinent being majority male as well, and that Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America is majority female. Here you can see that it's all breaking down by the data, and I have underlined the most gender extreme countries of both genders. So in the red table, you can see that Thailand and the Philippines are the most gender extreme, with 78% and 76% respectively. And on the male side, you can see Afghanistan and United Kingdom with 63% and 65% respectively. So the key points is that male majority migration into Sweden is coming from Western Europe, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent, while majority female migration is coming in from Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Let's take a look at Germany. Now, here's the map of Germany, and the unfortunate thing about these other countries that I'll be presenting is that they do not present the data of all the countries coming in. You usually have only the top 50 countries, and if you're lucky at that. Now, the thing about Germany is that they also divide by continent. So when I was not able to get the national data, I was able to get the continental data. So here you can see that the map is a little bit different from Sweden when it comes to Western Europe. But if you were to just look at the data outside of the Western world, so outside of the EU and the United States, you get a similar picture with that Eastern Europe, such as Russia and Ukraine, majority female, Southeast Asia, majority female. And you can see Latin America as well is majority female over there. And the usual suspects of the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and Africa is majority male. Here you can see it broken down by data. And again, the most gender extreme ones are underlined. So on the female side, the most extreme ones are Thailand and the Philippines with 72% and 82% respectively. And on the male side, you can see Afghanistan and United Kingdom respectively, both having about 63.5%. So the key points here are relatively the same. Majority male migration from the European Union, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. And majority female migration from Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. So let's take a look at the results from the United Kingdom. Here you can see the map. And the big difference here is that all of the Western world, with the exception of Australia, has majority female migration coming into the United Kingdom, presumably because of all of the education, universities, and colleges that exist in the United Kingdom. That tends to, universities tend to be overwhelmingly female nowadays, so this is not a surprising result at all. Let's take a look at it broken down by the data, and I have made the list a little bit longer here and underlined 3 countries, the most extreme on both the male and the female side. So on the female side, we have Thailand, Taiwan, and Sweden with 74%, 68%, and 70% respectively. On the male side, we have Afghanistan, Greece, and Sri Lanka, and Egypt. 70%, 57%, and 59% respectively. So the key points here are relatively the same, with majority male migration coming in from North Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent, and majority female migration coming in from Europe, the Americas, and Southeast Asia. And lastly, out of the I only decided to analyze 4 countries because 4 countries I felt was enough of a sample base to review these trends and these migration patterns. So if we look at the data of Italy, we get this map. And here we only had, I think, 40 countries to from which we could get detailed migration data broken down by gender. And what you can see here is that outside of the European and Western world, the migration patterns are relatively the same with a few exceptions. So Eastern Europe, you see highlighted in red. You see Asia, in particular China and Philippines, highlighted in red. The Indian subcontinent is blue. Northern half of Africa is blue, and Turkey is blue. Iran was very close to a 50-50 balance, if I remember correct. So here we can see the migration data into Italy broken down by gender, with the most extreme ones being on the female side, Russia and Georgia, 81% and 86% respectively. And on the male side, you can see that Mali and Gambia both have 95% male populations in Italy. So the key points here are that male majority migration is coming in from North Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. And majority female migration is coming in from Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. The general trends. Some variations in migration when it comes to the Western world, but all of these 4 countries that I have looked at the data has similar migration patterns when it comes to outside of the Western world. So if you just look at, Africa, Latin America, the rest of Asia, it tends to be a similar picture. So what we get is Northern African migration tends to vary between 55 and 75%. The Middle East migration is male-dominated, varying between 51 to 59%. The Indian subcontinent migration is male-dominated, varying between 51 and 72%. On the female side, Eastern Europe, outside of the EU countries, you have migration of the female side of 61 to 81%. Southeast Asian migration is female-dominated, varying between 57 to 82%. And the Latin American migration is female-dominated, varying from 55 to 74%. So the question is, what causes women to migrate to Europe? The predominant cause for women to migrate to Europe is marriage migration. A woman marries a man in Europe, which allows her to work and live in his country. The European men get in contact with women via online dating, vacations, and/or even family associates. They then settle together in a man's native country, create a family, and these women stay in the country permanently. Very few women ever move back to their home country. The countries that women tend to come from are middle-income countries. They are not living impoverished, but significantly below the Western living standards. The countries that the women tend to come from are relatively stable, usually with no famines, wars, or revolutions happening. They also tend to be popular destinations for vacations, such as Thailand, Brazil, and Cuba. Now, a notable exception here is, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine, but all of these trends were very clear even before that war happened. These trends have been going on for multiple decades at this point. So let's try to figure out what's going on here by asking a few questions. So question number 1, why do so many Western European men marry a woman from a middle-income country? Number 2, what are the demographic and economic problems within Western Europe that causes so many men to search for wives abroad? And number 3, what kind of men is it that tends to marry a foreign woman? So I'm going to start this by listing the 4 significant factors that I think should be noted, and then I'll be continuing the presentation with the 4th and last factor. So factor number 1 is that a natural male surplus is caused by increasing the male life expectancy and having no wars in Western Europe for almost 3 generations. 51.5% of all babies born are men, and only 48.5% of all are women. This is insignificant at first, but it starts to accumulate over generations and starts to become a significant factor nowadays. So the male life expectancy tended to be very short, and men tended to die a lot sooner than the women. So this was not a factor most of the time. It usually balanced itself out when it came to young adults. But we've done a lot to make sure that everyone lives until old age. So this has started to accumulate. Factor number 2, the sexual liberation have favored high status men, as they were able to get remarried multiple times over their lifespan. Now it's common to see men who are what I would call 2 generations fathers, who had children with multiple different women. This has become a serious factor causing gender imbalances. And yes, this has always happened across history, but I do think that this is increased a lot over the last few decades. Factor number 3, larger differences in political views. Men are becoming more conservative, while women are becoming more progressive. In the past, they used to be more similar. Now it's common for young women and young men to have difficulties dating due to their political views not being shared by the opposite gender. And lastly, factor number 4, gender segregation caused by economic policies. Women become majorities in the cities, while men become large majorities in the rural communities. Young women and young men, now more than ever, live in 2 different places of the country. So let's have a look at some evidence for that 4th and last factor. That's what I'll dedicate the rest of my presentation for. So this map shows the male to female ratio, and a number 1 score means that there is an equal amount of men and women in that country. And if the score is below 1, then that means that women outnumber the men. So what you can see here is that there's a clear east and west divide in Europe, with the former Soviet countries having a lot of women and a shortage of men. Now, the most extreme one at 0.86 is Russia, and that equates to 46.5% of the population being men and 53.5% of the population being women. So that's a 7-point difference. It results in 11 million more women in Russia than men. And what you can see is that in Western Europe, you have it way more equal. In particular, Northern Europe, the ratio is at 1 or even a little bit above 1 in some of the countries. If we take a closer look at the Nordic countries, which had almost 1 or a 1 ratio, you get this map. What you see here is every region male to female ratio, and all of the red is wherever the men outnumber the women, and all of the blue color you see is where the women form the majority. And you don't have to study the Nordic countries' geography or where the cities are, but I can tell you that all of the blue areas you see on the map are urban centers. They are the cities. And all of the red is the rural countryside. And you can see that, especially in the northern parts, it gets more and more extreme. This becomes particularly dire for the islands such as Greenland, Svalbard, and the Faroe Islands. So let's take a closer look at the Faroe Islands, because that was the most extreme one. So the Faroe Islands is a rural land with basically no cities, and they have detailed immigration data. Yes, it is demographically speaking insignificant, but it is a good proxy for studying this rural versus urban divide, as they have really good immigration data. So I'm going to quote here from an article from the BBC. Wives wanted in the Faroe Islands. In recent years, the Faroes have experienced population decline with young people leaving, often in search of education, and not returning. Women have proved more likely to settle abroad. As a result, according to Prime Minister Axel Johansson, the Faroes have a gender deficit with approximately 2,000 fewer women than men. And to give you a perspective of how much 2,000 women are in the Faroe Islands, I'm going to break down some math here real quick. So the Faroese Islands have 54,300 people, of whom 26,000 are women, whereas 6,000 are girls below the age of 18. It means that 2,000 adult women immigrating to the Faroe Islands is a 10% increase in the adult female population. So that is very significant. If we take a look at Svalbard, Svalbard is interesting because it also has detailed immigration data and it has no visa requirements. So anyone from across the world is allowed to live and work in Svalbard. And this has caused some interesting immigration trends. So in Svalbard, there are 2,354 people. Out of these, about 10% of the population are from Southeast Asia. Of these people who are from Southeast Asia, about 75% of them are women, most of whom are in a relationship with a Norwegian man. So why would so many Southeast Asian women decide to immigrate to one of the coldest places on the planet to be in a relationship with a Norwegian man? Let's take a look at the job gender gap. So in industries such as agriculture, manufacturing, mining, transport, construction, and infrastructure, these are job sectors and industries that are very prevalent in rural communities, and they are also very overwhelmingly dominated by men. There's very few women in these industries. And you can take jobs such as electricians, technicians, mechanics, miners, carpenters as an example. All of those jobs I just mentioned are over 97% male dominated. And they are also very common and normal jobs in these rural communities. If you were to look at the industries that are typically dominated by women, it is, for example, healthcare, education, consumer services, and the public sector. Now, these industries tend to be concentrated in the cities because all of those four industries I mentioned have to often deal with people. And it just makes sense to have an industry that deals with people as close to as many people as possible. So you want it often at the center of a city. Jobs such as nurses, assistants, preschool teachers, hairdressers, dietitians, and cosmetologists are all over 90% female dominated and mostly exist in these large urban environments. So as a result of these gender differences, women move to the cities while men stay in the rural communities. This causes young men and young women to live in two different places of the country. Whenever they attempt to live together in one location, it often leads to one partner losing their job and their career, which can be devastating if you have put all this education and all this investment into a certain path in life. It can be, what was it all for if you're just going to lose it all, right? Housewives, a thing of the past. A big gender divide between rural and urban is a recent development. In the past, it was common for women to be housewives, which was really positive for rural communities. So if you think, okay, most of the jobs in these rural communities are dominated by men, and that's okay because a lot of the women back in the past used to be housewives, and this really helped with the gender balance of these communities. However, European countries have for generations now tried to get as many women as possible to get an education, get a job, and then develop a career. In many countries, it has even been a stated goal to reduce the number of housewives to make it a thing of the past. A recent example of this would be Ireland. So about a month ago, Ireland had a referendum that was hoping to change the Irish constitution. It was the Family Amendment and the Care Amendment referendums, where they basically had the issue with housewives being protected in the constitution of Ireland. And the government, led by Leo Varadkar, wanted to change this and remove housewives from the constitution. However, the Irish people overwhelmingly voted against this, and I think it was about 70% of the population voted to keep the constitution as it is, which eventually caused Leo Varadkar to resign as the Irish Prime Minister. Only 3 countries in Europe, the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Italy, have homeschooling protected as a right in the Constitution. In all other countries, homeschooling is either illegal or under heavy restrictions. So if you think about what housewives would often do, is that besides taking care of the home and raising the kids, they also very often combined this with homeschooling children in these rural communities that are very far away from cities. And if you remove that opportunity, then it makes less logical sense to even have a housewife to begin with. The current tax system and economic situation means that most families require 2 parents working full-time to maintain the middle-class lifestyle in Europe. Having a housewife have become a luxury that only a few can afford. Losing your job during a time of economic hardship puts you in a precarious situation. However, staying with your job is also what may prevent you from being able to find a partner to marry. Marriage migration. Is it a permanent solution? So, in many of the rural communities all across Europe, marriage migration is larger than the economic and political migration. The women coming to these rural communities are usually more willing to apply for the jobs available in that community, start new businesses, which is often tied to her culture. However, marriage migration does not change any of the 4 factors previously listed, and the children born from mixed couples will have to deal with the exact same challenges as their parents did. The cycle just repeats itself. Marriage migration is therefore not a permanent solution. It solves the problem for one man for one generation and causes the demographics of your country to change a lot in the process. It's not good for your European country to have marriage migration coming in for multiple generations in a row from countries that are very different from Western European nations. More sustainable if marriage migration is coming in from nations similar to your own. So we have now looked at the data. We have now looked at some of the developments happening. And on top of that, I also want to give you a predictive model that you can use on the trajectory of these immigrant groups residing in Western Europe. So there is a concern among right-wing groups across Western Europe, across the entire Western world, that due to minority groups having a higher fertility rates, they will eventually become the majority population in a few generations. The people concerned look at the total number of immigrants, then that group's fertility rate, which tends to be a little bit higher than the average, and then conclude that the minority group will grow over time. However, a third factor must be included as well, and that's the gender balance. If an immigrant group is, for example, 70% male, and fertility rate is calculated on the number of kids per woman, then that group can still be in decline despite having high fertility rates. For a minority group to continue to preserve its culture and identity, you need a relatively balanced amount of men and women in that group. Both men and women are needed to pass on a culture to the next generation. With minority groups that are disproportionate towards one gender, they will have to date and marry people outside of their own group, or else they will have no children. So I will continue now with a mathematical example, and I'll take the Bangladesh minority in Italy, which is about 150,000 people and almost 72% male. So if we take that 150,000 people and try to calculate the number of women, it would be around 28% women, right? So that would equate to about 42,550 Bangladeshi women. And let's say that we give all of those Bangladeshi women a high fertility rate of 2.2 children per woman. Then that would result in 93,390 Bangladesh children being born. And if you noticed, 93,000 children is a lot less than 150,000 people. In fact, that is an almost 38% decline in the Bangladesh minority population in Italy. So even if you give the Bangladesh minority in Italy a high fertility rate of 2.2 children per woman, the group will still see a 38% population decline simply because of the group being overwhelmingly male at 71.7%. The high fertility rate of minority groups in Europe lasts only the first generation. The second generation of immigrants have fertility rates that are similar or lower than the native population. Majority female groups will assimilate over time. The opposite effect happens with minority groups that are overwhelmingly female. If you include their descendants, then their numbers will increase, despite having fertility rates below 2.1 children per woman. If a group is, for example, 70% female, then it very likely means that a large proportion of them came to the country through marriage migration and are thus married to a man native to the country they're in. This makes assimilation a lot easier. Since most of the children in these relationships have a European father, it means that they are often raised with a native culture, language, and religion. It is common for such interethnic children to not know how to speak the language that is native to their mother. This means that a majority female migration that European countries get a lot of from some countries will unlikely form parallel societies. Instead, you get cultural fusion where the first, the second, or the third generation of immigrants have completely assimilated into the native European culture. So now I'm going to take another mathematical example with the Thai minority in Sweden. So there's about 46,000 of them, of whom 78.4% are female. Now, if you take those 46,000 multiplied by 78.4%, you get about 36,000 Thai women. And let's say that those 36,000 Thai women have a low fertility rate of just 1.5 children per woman. 1.5 is the European average right now. Then you would get 54,123 half-Thai children. Most of them will be half-Thai. Some of them will be full-time, but most of them will be half. Now, if you noticed, 54,000 is a lot higher than 46,000. In fact, that is a 17.6% increase in the Thai population in Sweden, most of which will, as I mentioned before, be half Thai. So even if you give the Thai living in Sweden a low fertility rate of just 1.5 children per woman, the group will still see a 17.6% increase simply because of the group being overwhelmingly female at 78.4%. What this means is that the long-term genetic impact of mass female migration will be much greater than the immigration of mass male migration into the European countries. The competitive dating market. In these calculations, if you noticed, I made the assumption that a lot of these men that come from the Bangladesh in Italy, that they are not going to have children of their own. And that is due to Europe right now having a large overabundance of young men already. The dating market have become highly competitive and the women have become more selective. The standards have been raised. One of the reasons why such large numbers of men travel to Europe from Northern Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent is because of the severe shortage of available women in their own countries. This is a demographic issue made worse by the prevalence of polygamy and cousin marriages among these ethnic groups. The men from these countries are on average much further down the socioeconomic ladder. They tend to on average have higher levels of unemployment, lower levels of education, higher levels of welfare dependency, higher levels of crime, and higher levels of obesity. All of these factors affect their dating prospects in Europe and makes it far more difficult for them to attract a European woman to marry and have children with than compared with European men. As a result, many of them will have a very low chance of finding a woman to have children with. If the Muslim minority group that is currently residing in Europe continues to have a large number of polygamous and cousin marriages, then that will result in most of their young men being unable to get married. A large proportion of these men will remain single for the rest of their lives. The minority group that will most likely be able to preserve their parallel societies in Europe for coming generations are those that are fairly gender balanced, have an in-group preference, some level of economic integration, and above average fertility rates. Only a few minority groups in Europe qualify on all points. An example of such a group is the Vietnamese community in the Czech Republic, which have been there for over 50 years. They came there in the 70s with a student exchange program between Soviet Czech Republic and the communist Vietnam. And ever since they arrived there 50 years ago, they have managed to form their own parallel society and keep to themselves, and it's gotten to the point where they are now recognized as a national minority in the Czech Republic. So let's make a summary of the main points of this presentation. Number one, mass female migration is happening across Europe. Millions of women are coming in from Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Most of them are able to settle in the country by marrying a European man. Point number two, mass male migration comes primarily from Northern Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. Most of them come as refugees or as economic migrants. Point number three, the mass female migration is driven by an abundance of European men unable to find women in their own country, choosing instead to search for women abroad. These men are disproportionately men living in the rural parts of Europe and occupied in male-majority occupations. Point number four, factors such as slightly more boys being born, longer life expectancies, the sexual revolution favoring high-status men, and a widening political gender divide have contributed to a large percentage of men having no other option but to search for a woman abroad in a foreign country. Point number five, the economic and cultural policies attempting to remove the concept of housewives exacerbated the gender segregation in Europe. Young women migrated to the cities for education and jobs that they would prefer to do, while most young men remained in the rural communities. Simply put, there's too few jobs for women in the rural communities. Point number six, a predictive model can be created using the gender balance of a group's likelihood of assimilation or forming a parallel society. The gender balance also helps to predict the demographic projections of that group. Majority female groups are more likely to assimilate, while majority male groups are less likely to assimilate but decline in numbers over time. Point number seven, the long-term genetic impact of female migration is greater than the male migration due to the women being more likely to have an inter-ethnic relationship with native Europeans. Large proportions of the immigrant men will never get married due to an overabundance of men on a highly competitive dating market. So, I would like to end this off with showing you a clip of the US. And this clip will show you that there are similar developments happening across the US. So it starts on the year 2000. It shows the male to female ratio in every county in the US, the blue being majority boys and the red being majority girls. And what you can see here over time is that at the start, it was a mix. You couldn't see any clear divides anywhere. But as you move on over time, it starts to become more and more blue in a lot of these states, particularly in the Midwest. And it goes all the way to 2020. And what you can see here is that there is a clear gender divide happening all over the US. So let's take a look at those two big contrasts. The year 2000, you see no clear trends with the exception of Alaska and Nevada, which are majority male all across the state. And then the year 2020, and then you can see there is a massive shift. I'll keep going back and forth so that you can see this contrast because I really want to make it clear. Year 2000, year 2020. Year 2000, year 2020. You can see that in real time, millions of women have left the rural communities that they were born in, grew up in, and they moved to the cities. And this caused a big gender gap in these rural communities so that they are overwhelmingly male, while the cities are, and all the urban areas are majority female. Thank you for watching my presentation on mass female migration patterns in Europe. I want to thank you all for attending this presentation. I really appreciate it, and I am willing to take any questions you have. Thank you.